I want to introduce Gerard Moran. Again, I said to Peter, you know, do you want to stand up here instead of me? And he said, no, would you do the computers? And I said, no. So I got the opportunity to introduce Gerry, an old friend, another friend, part of that gang who wandered the roads and the hills and the libraries and everything of Mayo and anywhere else we're allowed to. Gerry himself started off in the same profession that I did as a teacher, and he's from Castlebar, and he eventually ended up in that hallowed institution which we are all, most of us are attached to, Newport, and Gerry lectured there, and we were just talking about retirement, but I don't think he's going to talk about retirement. I think he's going to talk about escaping the famine. So without any further ado, Gerry, it's all yours.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to say how great it is to be back in Newport. My very early memories of Newport was my father bringing me for the famous ice creams in Chambers. Alas, they are no more. But the person I'm going to talk about today has become one of my great heroes, and that is the Quaker James Hack Tute. And indeed, if you're interested in the story of James Hack Tute, okay, there are copies of two of the books, they're collections of essays which tell the role of James Hack Tute in Irish history, one during the Great Famine, the other one in relation to his assisted emigration scheme. Because emigration has been one of the great exports that Ireland had in the 19th century. About 8 million people emigrated between 1815 and 1914 from Ireland. Now, it's the one thing I always emphasise is that these are 8 million stories. Okay, when we look at a figure very often escapes us in terms of what is behind the individual associated with that story. In the same way that the 55,000 Ukrainian refugees that are in Ireland at the moment, every one of them has an individual story. The thing about immigration is determined by two main factors, what we describe as pull and push factors. And the Irish experience in the 19th century, the push factors are where people are forced to leave, is largely associated with the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852, or even during what we call the Forgotten Famine, or the Little Famine of 1879 to 1881. And this just gives you some idea of the pattern in relation to Irish immigration from 1700 right up to 1960. And you see the numbers associated with it. But I mentioned there the numbers of Irish leaving. By the end of the 19th century, there were more Irish people living outside of Ireland than there were in Ireland itself. And if I put it in today's context, about 17.5% of Irish born are living outside of Ireland. The next country from the first world that has comparative figures are New Zealand, which has about 15% of its people living outside of New Zealand. For many in the 19th century, immigration was paid for by funds which the people themselves had, or largely through prepaid passage fares, remittances that were sent back by friends, relations, neighbours, which paid for the passage fare for people to join those who had already left. For many, the immigration was easy to do, but there was a cohort in which they could not pay for their own immigration. They relied on external forces like landlords, the poor law unions, philanthropists, and governments, such as the Australian, etc. James Hack Tute is the last of the philanthropists to be involved in paying the passage fares of people to leave from the west of Ireland. We're talking about, between 1882 and 1884, over 9,500 people actually leaving. While the Great Famine is regarded as the starting point for Irish immigration, when between 1845 and 1855, as you'll see there, 2.1 million people leave. And this it accelerates then after this, between 1855 and 1911, with 4.5 million that actually emigrate. But it must be noted that even before the famine, that immigration was on the rise. In the decade from 1835 to 1845, the numbers leaving were sort of increasing quite steadily. What the Great Famine did was accelerate the numbers. However, up to 1879, immigration is more regional in its focus. It is largely the very well-off areas that people are leaving from. And the numbers actually emigrating from the west of Ireland and the poorer areas of the west of Ireland does not keep pace in the same way as with the rest of the country. Now, we do know that the Great Famine is regarded as a major watershed in Irish history, leading to a massive population decline, the consolidation of holdings which led to a greater emphasis on pastoral farming, and a very high level of immigration. But many parts of the country retained what we call a pre-famine structure. So in many ways, you're talking about a type of a dual economy. The commercial Ireland, which is to be found in the east, the south, small parts of the west and the north. But a pre-famine economy that is to be found along the poorer areas. And this can be seen, especially in relation to the population. Okay, we know that the population in the country in general, after from 1841 onwards, is on the decline. Going from 8.25 million in 1841 to 6.6 million in 1851 and steadily declining. But look at these poor law unions in the west of Ireland, and you actually see the population is increasing at some occasions and decline, are just holding steady in the others. Okay, if we look at there, Swinford in particular, where the population increases from 51,500 to over 53,000. In Newport, it more or less holds sort of steady at around 16,600. But it doesn't tell us the full story, on account of the fact that there are parts of County Mayo in which, at a parish level, in which the population is increasing quite steadily. For example, on Achill Island, between 1871 and 1881, the population increases by 16%. In Bahola, which is in East Mayo, part of Swinford Poor Law Union, it increases by 9%. The main reason why why you have this is similar to pre-famine, where holdings are very small and remain very small. Here, if we look at the size of holdings, you get some idea. This is from 1881. And we can get some semblance in relation to how important the size of holding is. In 1880, the Bessborough Commission, a government-appointed commission, stated that holdings under 15 acres were uneconomical and could not support a family. But if these are the areas along the western seaboard, and you get some ideas as to where the problems sort of are. If we look at Newport here, in Newport, the 68% of the farms are under 15 acres, but 40% are under 5 acres. In Balmullet, 72% are under 15 acres, and 15% are under 5 acres. So these were regarded by a government commission as not being viable and not in a position to support a family. In order to be able to survive, families on these holdings had to pursue non-agricultural activities in order to pay their rent. This was through fishing, through seasonal migration, the manufacture of kelp. But the pattern in which how these holdings were problematic, this is from James Hack Tute when he is in the west of Ireland in 1880. It is important to realise that farms of 10, 15 or even 20 acres of land, according to its quality, are too small to support a family. It matters not whether a man has fixity of tenure or being a peasant proprietor, has no rents to pay. He cannot, unless he has some other source of income, live and bring up a family on the small farm under 10 or 15 acres of land which forms so large a proportion of the holdings in the west of Ireland. Now, he's not the only one who is suggesting that farms under 15 acres cannot support a family. Here's a landlord who worked with Tute on the emigration schemes, who had about 2,000 acres in Mayo and Galway, Rutledge Fair, in which he said, "It is certain that the occupiers of such holdings never could, nor ever did, live on the produce of the lands." And there are examples, small examples that we get to see how bad the situation. For example, on one of the townlands on Achill Island, there were 250 people trying to exist on 200 of very marginal land. The areas which were really, really important, that kept people going, kept them able to survive. Seasonal migration. And I'll just go on to the next one to give you some idea. Seasonal migration in the 1870s was mainly to be found along the west coast. And the main areas were Mayo, Donegal, Roscommon. Within Mayo, the main areas were Achill Island. It contributed about £12,000 a year in the early 1870s to the economy of Achill Island. About 1,000 migrants left in April, May, returning in September, October. Throughout the west of Ireland, the amount of money that it contributed is about 250,000, which is quite an enormous amount of money. In areas like Swinford, in the Swinford Poor Law Union, the figures suggest that about 50% of the population were seasonal migrants. But as Cormac O'Grada years ago suggested, the figures were down by about, they should be 20% higher. And when you take in the people who are indirectly involved or need seasonal migration, like young people who under the age of 16, or very old people who remain at home to look after the very young people, you're talking about nearly 90% of the population of Swinford Poor Law Union depending directly or indirectly on seasonal migration. But seasonal migration suffered quite badly towards the end of the 1870s, largely because of the mechanisation of British agriculture. The McCormick Reaper, it could do the work of 100 Irish labourers. As a result of that, there was very little work for migrant labourers in 1878 or 1879. On Achill, instead of the 12,000 that had been brought home early in the 1870s, it was now down to about 1,000. In fact, many of the families in Achill had to borrow in order for their loved ones to be able to come back. The decline in the price of kelp, and in areas like where Brian was talking about this morning, the Irish Keys, the manufacture of kelp was very important. It is estimated that about £50,000 came into the Western economy as a result of the manufacture of kelp. But again, by the late 1870s, it was under threat. Under threat from the industrial potash being produced by large factories in Germany, and also the importation of Guyana from South America. Another major problem was the increased American agricultural competition. This was where, okay, the Midwest in particular had been opened up by the railways. So as a result, you got the grain and agricultural produce come into Europe and be sold much cheaper. Shopkeepers no longer giving credit to farmers at this particular time, on account of you had a financial crisis in 1876 with the J. Cook Bank in the United States, which had ripple effects in Europe. But the most important reason for the crisis of 1879 to 81 was the failure of the potato. In Balmullet, Porloy Union, 3 acres on average of a farm was devoted to tillage, 2 acres of which went to the growing of potatoes. So this was the main source which people had, and we're talking now about 1879, 1880. You have your 3 months of virtual continuous rain. I was reminded a bit about it there during lunch when we saw that horrendous shower coming down. But it destroyed the potato crop. The yield of the potato in 1879 was on par with Black 47, 1.4 tons per acre. The crisis of 1879 to 1881 was only averted by the private relief organisations. If we look here in County Mayo, 146,000 were being kept alive by one of these relief organisations, the Mansion House Relief Committee, Duchess of Marlborough Relief Committee, the Land League, New York Herald Relief Committee, or from the Archbishop of Tuam. That is 70% of the population of County Mayo in late 1879, 1880 were only being kept alive handouts that were being given to the local relief committees that had been established in the west of Ireland. It was around this time that James Hack Tute came to Ireland. He was sent by the Society of Friends to report on the extent of the famine and to work with the 2 main relief organisations, the Mansion House Relief Committee and the Duchess of Marlborough Committee. He arrived in February 1880 and over the next 10 weeks visited Donegal and the west of Ireland. Now, Tute was probably the ideal candidate to send, because in 1846 and 1847 he had toured the west of Ireland reporting on conditions that he had witnessed as he went around places like Balmullet, Achill, Newport, etc. The one thing about Tute, he was not afraid to condemn those who he felt should have helped in helping sort of people. To the extent, Sir Richard O'Donnell, he criticised because of evictions that had been carried out in Achill Island. Now, a bit unfairly so. O'Donnell had leased the land to the Achill Church Mission Society, and they were the ones who had carried out the evictions. But O'Donnell was so incensed, he threatened that if Tute ever set foot in County Mayo, he would have him shot. One of the interesting things is, during his visit to Mayo in 1882, he goes to Newport House to O'Donnell's granddaughter and has tea with her. And as he says himself in his letters, he said, who would have think I would be here after what I said in 1846, 1847. Now, O'Donnell wasn't the only one he criticised during the Great Famine. He also wrote Christmas of 1847. But what we can see in his writings in these period is his empathy with the Irish. And we can see it here when he writes in 1847. I regret that I feel so incomplete to express or describe the state of total helplessness that those gentle suffering people are reduced to. Tenants of absentee landlords are neglected by those who are living in luxury, from the rents collected from the wretched people. Their patience is beyond belief. 40 years later, he was still saying the same thing about accord. In fact, you got he spends his 10 weeks going round Donegal and the west of Ireland, but he comes to the conclusion that the conditions of the people is every bit as bad in 1880 as it had been in 1846 and 1847. It had not improved to any great extent. And this led him to look for a solution. And almost immediately, he leaves in April 1882, and he goes immediately to the United States and Canada, in particular to the Midwest and to Ontario and Manitoba. Speaking to very influential people, these were people like President Hayes of the United States, John A. Macdonald, who was the Prime Minister of Canada, and Bishop John Ireland, who was the Bishop of St. Paul in Minnesota, and who was to play a very important role in the emigration schemes. But he comes back, and he writes an article which is published in the 19th century in April of 1882 in relation to family immigration. Families and not individuals should be assisted. Now, the reason for this, there was two main points to it. Firstly, by sending out families, it meant that a farm would be vacated and the land could be redistributed to adjoining tenants, making their holdings more sort of economical. Also, if young individuals left, as tended to be the main way with emigration, you still had the older people left behind, sort of holding on to the farm. At least one family member would have to be able to speak English, because most of the areas that Tute went to, they were Gaelic, Irish-speaking areas, and in order for them to be able to integrate and assimilate, there would have to be a situation whereby somebody would be able to speak English. There had to be a sufficient number of breadwinners in the family. In other words, you could not have a family in which 5 to 6 of the members were under 10 years of age, on account of the fact they would not be able to survive, according to Tute. And the immigrants should contribute towards their transport. As he went along, he mentioned how the poverty is unspeakable, and that misery and suffering are borne out that can never be revealed until some stranger comes poking into those out-of-the-way corners. But I think, this statement which he makes to the Parliamentary Commission just showed sort of the empathy he had with the poor of Ireland. He was asked at the time, why are you helping these paupers from the west of Ireland? And he said, I hardly like to use the word paupers, because these people are the rank and file of the poorer classes of the district. Now, the article comes out in April 1882. It resulted in a number of his friends sort of coming together and organising a meeting on the 31st of March 1882 in the London home of the Duke of Bedford, in which established the Tute Committee for the Furtherance of Family Immigration from the rest of Ireland. £9,600 was subscribed to help sort of families move from the west of Ireland to North America. The first place he actually goes to is Clifton. And the reason he goes to Clifton is on account of the fact the poor guardians in Clifton decided that they would provide money towards assisted immigration, £2,000. So Tute felt he could work with these. But 10 days after he arrived in Clifton, he comes to Newport, and he actually stays in the home of Vesey Stoney in Mulranny. And unpublicised, what Tute is actually trying to find out, to what extent would families emigrate if a scheme was put in place? And this is what he said. I think I mentioned in writing that on visiting Mulranny near Achill on Monday, and although not expected, I had applications from over 70 families or parts of families in that one small district. There had been no publicity about Tute actually coming to Mulranny, or nothing about his scheme. What he wanted was, he wanted to see the advice of Vasey Stoney. Now, when he interviewed some of the families, he realised immediately that it wasn't going to happen, because none of the families could make any contribution towards their travel fare out. Another reason why he comes to Mulranny is that he had heard that the Newport Board of Guardians had decided to look for a loan in order to facilitate assisted immigration. However, he found out that the loan was only £100. So you were talking about 20 families or thereabouts that could be sent. So it wasn't feasible. Now, the other problem that he had at this stage was the decision in Clifton to not go ahead with the loan that they were looking for. So all of the work was put into Clifton in 1882, and it resulted in 1,276 people being assisted from Tute. Sorry, that there is John Ireland. I'll come back to this one in a moment. But these are the numbers that leave in 1882. Now, the reason I put it up there is he arrives in Clifton on the 4th of April. On the 19th of May, 6 weeks later, he has sent out 1,267 people. Think of the organisation. Think the interviews, the selection process, and then organising them, bringing them into Galway, then from arriving in Quebec or Boston, and all of that done within 6 weeks. But what it does teach him, what he realises, that immigration cannot be carried out by a private organisation. That really, the government had to come on board. So representations were made to the Gladstone administration. He used his contacts, his friendship, his business acquaintances, etc. And in 1882, the government decided that they were going to push the £100,000 for assisted immigration, which would include the Tute committee. Now, in addition to Clifton, Balmullet, Newport and Oughterard were to be administered as well by the Tute committee. From now on, the administration of the immigration scheme by Tute, the Tute committee, was given over to an assistant of Tute, Sidney Buxton. And so he looks after the whole thing in Balmullet and in Newport. Now, and these are the boats that they leave. There's 11 of them that leave from Clew Bay, because everybody was from Blacksod Bay, because everybody was actually sent down to Blacksod Bay to get the ship there. So people from Inishbeagle, Achill itself, Curran, they were all sent up to Balmullet and then on. One of the interesting ones here is the Fenaghan, on account of the fact the Lord Lieutenant came down specifically from Dublin to see the operation and came back very, very impressed. Because what had to happen was the ship could not come into Blacksod Bay itself, on account of the fact, as Brian was mentioning earlier, the waters are quite shallow for very large vessels. So instead, the British Navy had to use some of their smaller boats. One of them was the Seahawk, which carried the immigrants from the Blacksod near Ely out to the large ships. But you see here the destinations that they go to. Boston, Quebec are the main ones. Now, the reason why Quebec was the place was on account of the fact that the Canadian government had agreed that they would do all in their power to help the immigrants once they arrived in sort of Canada. And the other thing was that Tute would not let the immigrants go to Boston unless they had friends and relations who were prepared to support them. There's a very funny story that Sidney Buxton tells, how he's down interviewing them in Achill, sort of a group from Inishbeagle, and the head of the family comes in and he's asked, where do you want to go? I want to go to America. Do you know anybody in America? No. You can't go to America then, but we'll send you to Canada. I don't want to go to Canada, but it's the only place we will send you. No place else. Okay, I'll go, but don't send the wife with me. So you get some idea of the little story that are told along the way. But but here we have the figures from 1883, where they go from. And if you look, unfortunately, Sidney Buxton combined the numbers from Balmullet and Newport, and not differentiating between the two. But nevertheless, you have 2,500 that are sent from Balmullet and Newport. But if you look, the numbers that are sent to Canada. Now, the reason why there was a reluctance to go to Canada, there had been no tradition of immigration from the west of Ireland to Canada after the famine. People wanted to go to the States. But nevertheless, in total, 1,800 are sent. And they are treated extremely well. 650 of them are taken under the wings of Catholic clergy in Ontario. And they're provided with sort of accommodation, with work, etc. One of the very interesting ones that you got two families from Balmullet, but I can't find their names, who were sent to Peterborough, Ontario, who were looked after majestically. And while there, they were looked after by descendants. Why they're also to different destinations is. Tute did not want large numbers descending on one particular locality, which would result in opposition and hostility. By only sending one or two people to each parish, each area, it restricted the type of opposition that would be there too. Now, what do we know about what some of them said? Here is one who was in Balmullet, from Balmullet originally, and who's in in Minnesota. This is a good country. There is plenty of work and good wages. I mean to let you know that this is a splendid country for any person to come to. I started to work the following day after me arriving here. Dear friend, I can sit at a table as good as the best man in Balmullet. Thank God I left that miserable place. Now, what is significant? He's telling about his position in relation to wages, which is used very often to encourage others to leave. But the other really interesting here is, I can sit at the table as the best man in Balmullet. He would not have been able to sit with landlords, with their agents, etc. But here, he considered his social position had improved quite substantially. Quite a number of these letters, and there's about 200 of these letters from these immigrants. And the vast majority of them are so positive in relation to the new position that they have. However, what I've found very often in looking in general at immigration is that it is not the first letter or the second letter that tells you the story. It is very often the fifth or the sixth letter. Because the first or the second letter tells of the euphoria, how happy I am to be away from your poverty, etc. But the fifth or sixth letter tells of nostalgia, wanting to be back with their own. Now, in some cases, in 1884, which remained unspent and the government refused to allow Tute, to to spend it. But even back home, it does work out very, very well as well, on account of the fact most of the farms that were vacated were transferred over to other to neighbouring tenants, so that making their farms bigger and the more viable and able to support a family. As I mentioned earlier, if you're interested in the Tute story, and because, as I said, he is one of my great heroes and who has been largely forgotten. And I think part of the reason why he has been forgotten is on account of the fact he refused point blank to get any publicity for what he was doing. Not only was he involved in the immigration scheme, but he saw immigration as just part of the immediate solution that was needed to the problem of overpopulation in the west of Ireland. But he wanted its economic development. From 1886, he was working with Arthur Balfour, the Chief Secretary, in order to the establishment of a train system in places like Donegal, Connemara, and Mayo. He is the person as well. I've seen his paper, the papers of Tute, which are in the University of Limerick, in which he, the driving force behind the establishment of the Congested Districts Board when it was set up in 1891. There is not a monument, there is nothing to James Hack Tute in either Mayo or Galway. Last August, a monument was put up in the Connemara patch in St. Paul to honour Tute, but also other individuals like James Nugent, who were involved in bringing people from the west of Ireland to a better life in the Midwest. And I'll leave it there.